Now, let's turn to the perspective of the private sector, and we have three panelists here. Allow me to start with Mr. Comrie, since you are from South Africa, dealing with auto industry, and please just follow the flow of the discussion to start with. What is the changing consumer pattern? Perhaps you may wish to illustrate it with the auto industry, but talk about something about suppliers, capacity building, and clusters related issues.
Thank you, James. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think maybe just to first provide some context before I get into my response. The automotive industry in South Africa this year will produce about 700,000 vehicles, and probably about the same number will be sold domestically. Just to put that in perspective, while that is by and large the bulk of vehicles produced on the African continent, it only represents about 0.6% of global production. So South Africa is by no means a large player in terms of relative size, and so the South African automotive industry is also not in a position to really dictate design trends, as an example, or even production locations by virtue of the size of its market. So it basically needs to think very carefully, government at a policy level and the private sector at a strategy level, in relation to how what it has can be leveraged to optimal effect. And in due course, I'll refer to sort of demand-side considerations as well as supply-side considerations. What South Africa does have, and I think it's in quite an interesting position, is that it has an established production capability at an OEM or vehicle assembly level, at a Tier 1 level, and at a Tier 2 level. However, the domestic market is growing at a fairly moderate rate, and as a result, it's not really presenting the aggressive growth opportunities which are required to enable the industry to become truly globally competitive. That said, the regional economy is growing at a far more rapid rate and presents some interesting prospects. And on top of that, the industry has already established a strong sort of export capability with a number of finished vehicles exported to countries around the world. So if we look at some of the challenges that are presented to the industry, I mentioned already that it's a comparatively small player in global terms, that 700,000 odd production volume is shared amongst about 7 producers. It's geographically distant from major inputs, so a lot of core technologies remain imported from countries such as Japan, the US, and various countries in Western Europe, and that adds significant cost in the value chain. In terms of export markets, while I mentioned it has growing sort of neighboring markets, those markets currently import second-hand vehicles, allow for the importation of second-hand vehicles, which means that for producers to try and sell into that market is very, very difficult. So the export markets for South African producers at present tend to be your traditional developed markets around the world, and obviously South Africa is geographically distant from those markets. So again, adding cost into the value chain. So if we look at sort of the evolution of this industry going forward and critical issues, in my view, I would say the first is that of increased localization. So to try and better harness the opportunity presented by the fact that there is a reasonably sized domestic market, the first step is to try and ensure that the producers can compete effectively off the back of that. And that means trying to ensure that levels of local content in the value chain are increased, local value addition is increased, and through that they're able to compete more effectively. The second is that the producers themselves need to improve their competitiveness so that they're able to compete with other global players on a level playing field. And then lastly, and most importantly, is that issue of enabling regional trade and trying to find some sort of a win-win balance whereby the producers in South Africa are able to benefit from growth in the regional markets, but those regional markets are not adversely affected from a consumer perspective by an increase in product cost. And that really is a very challenging issue for the industry in South Africa. But if I was to compare those 3 points to the case of Thailand, I find that there's some striking similarities. If you look at the Thai automotive policy over the past few decades, we see that one of the first things that was done is that Thailand sought to try and leverage its local or its domestic market to enable the establishment of a sector that could be globally competitive. And basically what it sought to do is to channel domestic demand towards particular product categories and almost artificially use what ordinarily would have been a diverse domestic demand into a number of very narrow product categories, and so create artificial scale there. Off the back of that, it seems that Thailand was then able to improve levels of local content as well as competitiveness, and then ultimately take advantage of a more integrated regional trade environment. So if I was to look at South Africa and contrast it to Thailand, I think there are a lot of very interesting lessons that South Africa could learn, and lessons that, as the Minister referred to earlier, could potentially even benefit regional trading partners in terms of the synergies that may exist and productive capabilities that could be located in neighboring countries to the mutual advantage of both parties. That Thailand model has actually been remarkably successful. Thailand is currently positioned as the world's 8th largest producer of light vehicles, and the 2nd largest producer of light commercial vehicles in the world, behind the US. So that really is quite a remarkable achievement for a country of its population size. So what does this really mean for enterprises operating in the value chain, and particularly suppliers? What we've seen as South Africa has been integrated into global automotive value chains is that the first companies to change ownership were those of the vehicle assemblers themselves. So the vehicle assemblers in South Africa are uniformly part of very large global enterprises, and what subsequently followed is that increasingly the tier ones are also multinational owned. So the space that exists for independently owned SMEs now seems to emerge particularly at a tier 2 level. And those companies are obviously confronted indirectly with the same demand side challenges, so lower economies of scale, and hence would benefit from regional market integration, in that their customers or they themselves directly would be able to improve economies of scale and hence become more competitive. But on a supplier side, there are additional considerations, and one of the organizations that I represent, the Durban Automotive Cluster, I think represents an interesting model in terms of how the public and the private sector can collaborate to try and enhance value chain competitiveness. I think government is very comfortable engaging at a policy level, and when you move down to a meso or a microeconomic level, I think it becomes increasingly difficult for government to engage meaningfully at that level and understand how industry may need to adapt to a very rapidly changing and globalized environment. And this particular partnership is quite interesting in that it's a permanent partnership between local government and about 40 companies. It's been in place for about 10 years now. And it basically allows industry and government collectively to engage with a range of practical challenges that are hindering optimal growth and harnessing domestic market growth. Those are things like localization, skills development, even market access, and all sorts of related issues. And basically through that partnership, there are a range of very specific projects that can get initiated and are initiated to try and address those deficiencies and support improved value chain competitiveness. So I think really the sort of key principles in terms of I think what could be taken away from the experiences of the South African automotive industry are that the issue of regional integration is very important. The domestic market is very important as well. And I think that unless there's an appropriate policy mechanism in place to try and support value addition creation off the back of the domestic market, it's very difficult for individual enterprises to compete, so appropriate policy mechanisms are really important. But below that, there's an additional space that exists where industry and government need to collaborate more closely in relation to making decisions and putting in place interventions that can enable enterprises to compete effectively within that policy environment.
Thank you very much, Comrie, illustrating the auto industry case in this global value chain and the challenges.